All right, welcome to another deep dive. We get lots of requests, and one that keeps popping up is how to speak English more fluently.
Yeah, that seems to be a common sticking point.
Totally. I mean, understanding, that's one thing, but actually speaking it, that's where things get tricky. So today we're diving into a couple of resources that tackle this head on.
Sounds good. What do we got?
Okay, so first up, a YouTube video. It's from the Daily English Podcast, and it's called English Podcast Understand English but Can't Speak Tips to Start Speaking Confidently. The host is a guy named Paul.
Okay, and what about the other source?
It's a blog post from Preply called How to Speak English Fluently 14 Powerful Tips and Tricks.
So both focus on getting over that speaking hump. Interesting.
Right, and both actually emphasize the same kind of frustration. Like, you get it, you understand English, but then
But then you freeze up when you try to speak.
exactly. It's like
Yeah.
all the pieces are there, but you just can't seem to put them together. And Paul, in that video, he uses this really cool analogy of training your language muscles.
Makes sense. You can't expect to just, magically be able to speak. It takes practice.
It's like, okay, you can listen to amazing piano music all day long, but that doesn't make you a concert pianist. You got to practice those finger movements, right?
And the reply article, they take it even further with their analogy. They compare it to, well, baking a cake. Having all the ingredients, that's great. Flour, sugar, eggs. But that doesn't mean you can automatically bake a cake.
You need the recipe. You need the technique. You need to practice.
Right. So it's not just about learning vocab or grammar rules.
It's about actually training your brain to speak the language, like literally training it.
Yeah. And that's where the whole neuroscience thing comes in. See, understanding a language and actually speaking it, those are handled by different parts of your brain.
Okay, so even if I can follow a movie, my brain might not be ready to actually speak.
Well, understanding is more about decoding, right? But speaking, that activates a whole other area called Broca's area.
Broca's area.
It's like the speech production center of your brain. And just like any other part of your brain, it needs training to work smoothly, especially in a new language.
Okay, so even if I can understand spoken English, my Broca's area might be way behind, like, hold on, got to figure out how to make these sounds.
Exactly. And that's why both of these sources, they really emphasize this idea of thinking in English.
Thinking in English.
So it's not just about translating from your native language in your head,
Yeah.
It's about actually forming thoughts directly in English.
That sounds tough.
It can be. But think of it like you're creating new pathways in your brain, bypassing that need to translate everything.
Like building a bridge straight to English.
Exactly. And one way to start doing that, it's by immersing yourself in the language as much as possible.
That's something Paul talks about in the video, right? Like surrounding yourself with English.
Yeah, even if you don't live in an English-speaking country, there's still tons you can do.
Music, movies. He even says, like, change your phone settings to English.
Exactly. It's about training your ear, getting used to the rhythm and the flow.
And the Reply article, they suggest starting small. Like, pick one thing to immerse yourself in this week. Maybe listen to an English podcast during your commute.
Great idea. Small steps.
Okay, now here's something both sources really hammered on. Embracing your mistakes. Which, honestly, I struggle with that big time.
Yeah, making mistakes. It's part of the process, though, right?
It can be so frustrating, though. Stumbling over words, feeling like you're not getting your point across.
For sure. But both Paul and the Reply article, they want us to, reframe how we see those mistakes.
So not as failures.
More like feedback.
Oh, I see. Little clues about what to work on.
Exactly. They even compare it to a baby learning to walk. I mean, babies, they fall constantly, right?
Yeah.
But each fall is a learning experience. Helps them figure out how to balance, how to coordinate their movements.
And eventually they're running around like crazy.
Exactly. And Reply uses this term, growth mindset. It's about seeing challenges as opportunities to learn and improve.
And in the video, Paul, he actually admits that even native English speakers make mistakes. It's kind of comforting, actually. We're all human, right? Nobody's perfect.
Yeah, definitely takes the pressure off a bit.
He even suggests recording yourself speaking and then listening back without judgment, just to, like, analyze it. Have you ever tried that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It can be kind of cringy at first, hearing your own voice.
But it's helpful, right?
Super helpful. You start noticing patterns, things you might not realize you're doing.
So you become your own language coach, but a much nicer one, hopefully.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's talk about some specific techniques. Both sources mention shadowing as being super powerful for fluency. What exactly is that?
So shadowing is basically mimicking a native speaker. You choose some audio or video, something you enjoy, and you speak along with it.
So you're trying to match their pronunciation, their rhythm, everything.
Exactly. And Paul, he recommends starting with short segments and gradually increasing the length as you get more comfortable.
That makes sense. Don't want to get overwhelmed. It's almost like you're becoming the speaker's vocal shadow.
I like that. And Paul also puts out, it's not just about getting the words right. It's about paying attention to those subtle things, like where they put the stress in a sentence, how their tone of voice changes.
Ah, the nuances. Those make a huge difference, I bet.
Huge. It's about capturing the music of the language, not just the words.
Okay, and then there's another technique that Paul talks about called chunking. What's that all about?
So chunking is about breaking down sentences into smaller, more manageable pieces.
Instead of trying to say a whole long, complex sentence all at once.
Exactly. You master those smaller chunks first, and then you can start piecing them together more smoothly. It's like, no, it's less overwhelming that way.
So instead of trying to build a whole Lego structure at once, you're focusing on mastering those individual Legos first.
Perfect analogy. You build your fluency brick by brick, chunk by chunk, and eventually you can create something amazing.
I'm loving how these techniques all kind of tie together, but I think it's important to remember practicing in isolation, that's only part of it, right? At some point, we got to use English in the real world, and that can be, well, terrifying.
For sure. But the Play article, they remind us that fluency, at its core, it's about communicating effectively in different contexts.
Not just sounding like a textbook, but actually using the language to connect with people.
Exactly. And Paul, he's got some great advice for finding those real-world practice opportunities. He suggests, maybe joining English-speaking groups.
Okay, so finding ways to use English in a natural way in situations you enjoy.
Exactly. He even says, think about your hobbies. Can you find ways to incorporate English into them?
Turn your passion into practice. I like that.
And the Play article, they highlight some great digital options too, things like language exchange apps or online conversation groups.
So even if you don't have access to English speakers in person, there are ways to connect online.
Absolutely. And, with all the
Yeah.
technology we have now, it's easier than ever to find those opportunities.
So maybe this week, everyone listening, think about one specific opportunity where you could use your English, even if it's just for a few minutes, just to dip your toes in the water and start building that confidence.
That's a great challenge. And remember, even small steps can make a big difference over time.
So wrapping up this first part of our deep dive, I think it's clear that becoming fluent in English, it's not just about memorizing vocabulary or grammar rules, it's about training your brain, embracing those inevitable stumbles, and finding ways to practice consistently in real-world settings. And you know what? It's also about having the right mindset.
Oh yeah, mindset's huge.
We'll dive more into that in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back. As we keep digging into this whole speaking English fluently thing, one thing that really jumps out from both sources is this emphasis on mindset. It's not just about the technical stuff.
Yeah, I hear that a lot about mindset being important, but honestly, I'm not always sure what that actually means, in practice. Like, what are they saying about it in these sources?
Well, the ProPly article talks about this idea of a growth mindset. It's
Yeah.
basically seeing those challenges as opportunities to learn and improve instead of roadblocks. And it's about, being kind to yourself along the way, realizing setbacks are normal.
That makes sense. I know I can be pretty hard on myself, especially when I make mistakes or if I feel like I'm not progressing fast enough.
Yeah, and Paul touches on that in the video too. He's all about setting realistic expectations. It's
Yeah.
easy to compare yourself to native speakers or think you should be fluent overnight.
Yeah.
But any skill takes time and effort.
Patience, patience, patience. But how do you actually cultivate that growth mindset, especially when you're feeling stuck or discouraged? Any tips on that?
One thing Paul talks about is really focusing on those everyday phrases.
Oh, like the basic building blocks of conversation.
Exactly. He says mastering those, even if they seem simple, can give you a real sense of accomplishment.
It's like laying a strong foundation, right?
Totally. And when it comes to those inevitable stumbles, remember what we said before, mistakes are feedback, not failures.
Right, right.
Paul actually encourages learners to record themselves speaking and then listen back, without judgment, just to see what they can tweak.
Like an athlete watching game film.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
You can spot those patterns you might not even realize you're doing.
Oh, I can see how that would be helpful. Sometimes it feels like we're our own worst critics, right?
Oh, absolutely. Okay, so both sources also get into some of the reasons why speaking English can feel so hard. And they bring in some neuroscience here.
Ooh, brain stuff. Always down for that.
So they talk about how learning a new language, it actually involves rewiring your brain. It's not just memorizing words. It's about creating these new neural pathways,
Hmm.
for processing and producing the language.
We're literally changing our brains. That's wild.
Right. And they mentioned Broca's area again, that part of the brain we talked about before, the speech production center. It needs to be trained specifically for English, basically.
So even if I understand English perfectly, my Broca's area might still need some work to get those words out smoothly. It's like, I have all the ingredients for a cake, but I haven't learned how to bake it yet.
Love that analogy. And that's where those targeted practice techniques come in. Both sources highlight chunking is a really good way to overcome that overwhelmed feeling when you're trying to speak. Remember, we touched on that before.
Yeah, breaking sentences down into smaller bits, right?
Right. Instead of trying to blurt out this whole complex sentence,
Yeah.
you master those smaller chunks first. Makes it less intimidating.
Like building a house brick by brick instead of all the walls at once.
Perfect. And once those chunks become automatic, you can put them together so much easier.
Building fluency, one brick at a time. I like that.
And both sources also talk about shadowing. Remember that one?
Yeah, the mimicking thing.
Right. Paul suggests finding some audio or video that you enjoy and speaking along with it like you're their shadow.
So really pay attention to how they're saying the words.
Yep. He says it's good to choose something that's a little bit above your current level. So it's challenging, but not overwhelming.
Yeah.
And of course, recording yourself and listening back, that's always a good idea too.
Got to get that objective feedback. Okay, so practicing on your own, that's key. But both sources are also big on real-world interaction.
Right,
So-
absolutely. Fluency isn't just about sounding perfect by yourself. It's about using English to communicate, authentically.
So how do they suggest making that jump from practicing alone to actually talking to people? That can be scary.
Well, Paul talks about finding those opportunities to connect with English speakers, even if you don't live in an English-speaking country, like maybe joining an English-speaking group or finding a language exchange partner.
Okay, so finding those low-pressure situations to practice.
Exactly. And Preply echoes that. They suggest things like those language exchange apps we mentioned or online language cafes. It's all about creating those opportunities to practice, in a way that's fun and engaging.
Right, it's about expressing yourself, not just reciting grammar rules.
Totally. It's about taking your English skills out for a test drive. And remember, the goal isn't to be perfect. It's to be understandable and comfortable. So embrace those mistakes, see them as chances to learn, and keep pushing yourself a little further with each interaction.
I love that. Progress over perfection. So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I'm curious, what do they say about staying motivated and finding that support system to help you on this journey? Welcome back to the deep dive.
One thing that really stuck with me from both these sources is how they both kind of emphasize that it's not just about reaching the finish line.
Yeah, they both kind of present fluency as more of an ongoing journey. It's not about reaching this mythical perfect state. It's more about constantly expanding your comfort zone and just being able to communicate effectively in different situations.
Exactly. It's not a destination, it's a path.
Yeah.
And that actually connects to something else they both talk about, which is defining what fluency even means to you.
Oh, right. Because it's not one size fits all, is it? Like someone who wants to travel is going to have different goals than someone who, say, wants to work in an English-speaking environment.
Exactly. Reply, they hit on that specifically. They say, okay, if your goal is to travel, maybe fluency means, being able to order food at a restaurant or ask for directions without getting totally lost.
Right.
But if you're aiming for professional fluency, then you might need to, master more complex vocabulary,
Yeah.
right? And be comfortable navigating those tricky workplace conversations.
So it's all about setting those personal benchmarks, which honestly I think makes it less overwhelming because you're focusing on what actually matters for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's your journey.
Okay, and this brings us to something else they both discuss, which is the importance of finding a community, like a support system.
Yes, community is huge. Paul, he's a big advocate for that. He talks about finding language learning partners, maybe joining online groups where you can connect with other English learners.
Yeah, having that sense of shared experience, it can be so helpful, can it?
It's really motivating to know you're not alone in the struggles and to be able to celebrate each other's wins.
Exactly. And having people to practice with. Can't beat that.
Totally. And the Preply article, they also bring up the idea of a language tutor, someone who can give you that personalized guidance and feedback.
Which conveniently is something their platform offers. They've got this whole network of tutors from all over the world.
It's a great resource. You can find someone who really fits your learning style and your budget. Okay, so we've got those personalized goals, a supportive community, access to expert help, but then how do we actually stay motivated over the long haul? Because let's be real, learning a language takes time and dedication.
That's the million-dollar question, right? I know I've definitely started things with like a ton of enthusiasm and then poof, gone.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think we've all been there. Well, both these sources, they actually talk about the power of gratitude. It's about shifting
Mm.
your focus,
Yeah.
from what you still don't know to appreciating how far you've come. Like taking the time to celebrate those little victories.
I love that because it's so easy to get caught up in the I'm not good enough yet mindset. But when you actually pause and acknowledge those small wins, like learning a new word or having a conversation that felt a little bit smoother than before, that can be so motivating.
It really can. And remember those everyday phrases Paul talked about. Mastering those can give you a real confidence boost.
It's like having this little toolbox of go-to expressions. Makes those initial interactions a little less scary.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the main takeaway here is that speaking English fluently, it's a journey, not a destination.
It's your own unique journey with your own pace, your own goals, and your own rewards.
Absolutely. And no matter where you are on that path, just remember that progress is possible. With consistent effort, the right mindset, and that willingness to embrace the stumbles along the way. And hey, don't forget to celebrate those small wins, right? Because each step forward, no matter how small, it brings you closer to communicating confidently and connecting with the world through this amazing language.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into speaking English fluently. We hope you found it helpful and inspiring. Keep those words flowing.